1863 was an important year in the U.S. Civil War. After years of ineffective leadership and losses to the Confederates, the Union won two major victories at Vicksburg and at Gettysburg. But much less remembered that year was the Union attempt to bring the war back to where it started, Charleston, South Carolina. The Siege of Charleston represented some significant engineering innovations that presaged warfare for the next 60 years, as the Union attempted to retake the city and the fort that represented the very birth of the Confederacy. It is history that deserves to be remembered. The attack at Fort Sumter is generally considered the opening salvo of the American Civil War. South Carolina was the first state to secede on December 20th, 1860, and 4 months later the fort, unfinished and undermanned, was attacked by Confederate forces under General P.G.T. Beauregard. The garrison surrendered after 34 hours of bombardment. The Union defenders, low on ammunition and entirely without fuses for their explosive shells, returned fire only sparingly, but no casualties were caused by either bombardment. One Confederate soldier died after he was wounded by a misfiring cannon, while two Union soldiers were killed on the 47th shot of a 100-gun salute fired after the fort was surrendered. Charleston was an important city for the Confederacy. One of the largest Atlantic ports, it had excellent rail connections to much of the rest of the nation. Its defense was vital. To this end, the Confederacy improved defenses at Sumter and at Fort Moultrie with complements of troops and more cannons. At Fort Moultrie, new earthworks were built, and the seaward wall was covered with sand. Fort Sumter was repaired, became the harbor's main defense, holding the heaviest guns in the Charleston arsenal. Defenses were also prepared on James Island, a likely landing target that provided the best land approach to Charleston proper. A battery was also built on Morris Island, which faced Sumter's weakest wall. Federal troops threatened Charleston after they captured the island of Port Royal in November 1861. The South Atlantic Blockading Squadron used Port Royal Sound as a base for the rest of the war. Union forces moved northward, capturing Beaufort and reaching the rivers south of Charleston. In June of 1862, 7,500 troops from Port Royal briefly landed on James Island, threatening the city, and even fought a small battle at Secessionville, but were soon withdrawn. Defenses continued to improve. A wooden boom was positioned across the mouth of the harbor, and explosive canisters dubbed torpedoes were added to it, meant to explode if a ship ran into them. For the Union, Charleston represented a coveted, especially symbolic prize. Charleston was also a relatively important industrial site and one of the South's main blockade-running ports. One Union commander wrote, "I think the nation, as well as the Department of the Navy, has set its heart upon the fall of that city. I think justice demands it, at the hands of fate." Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles, Assistant Secretary Gustavus Fox, and Lincoln himself supported an attack on the city. The attack was in part meant to justify the expensive ironclad program, and most of the North's monitors and ironclads were committed to it. The Monitor, along with the frigate New Ironsides and most of the new Passaic-class monitors, were put under the command of Rear Admiral Samuel Francis DuPont, the flag officer of the South Atlantic Blockading Squadron. DuPont didn't like the two-gun monitors and doubted their usefulness against non-masonry defenses strengthened with sand. Each carried a 15-inch Dahlgren gun and a smaller gun, either an 11-inch Dahlgren or an 8-inch Parrott. It took 7 minutes to reload the guns. DuPont was in fact anxious about making the attack at all. Charleston Harbor, he said, was a porcupine hide with quills turned outside in and sewed up at one end. The threat of torpedoes terrified sailors, who feared a hole below the waterline would turn the monitors into well-armored coffins. His fears aside, on April 3rd, 1863, he finally ordered his squadron out of Port Royal Sound. His flagship was the frigate New Ironsides, accompanied by the odd tower ironclad Keokuk and 7 monitors. The plan was to sail to within 800 yards of Fort Sumter and blast it into submission. From there, Weehawken was equipped with a raft on the bow to clear obstructions. They would have to clear a morass of logs, netting, and torpedoes to attack the batteries on Morris Island. The Army landed a small force on Folly Island, but didn't plan on participating in the attack. The ships attacked on April 7th, but things went wrong almost immediately. An explosion caused Weehawken to veer, fearing a torpedo, and the ships following became confused. New Ironsides couldn't maneuver and had to drop anchor. The monitors only managed 154 shots, while Confederate defenses fired 2,209 shots and hit 20% of the time. 3 ships had to pull out of the fight early, and the Keokuk was hit 90 times and was so damaged that it sank the following day. Casualties were light. Only 1 man was killed on the Union side, and the Confederates reported 5 killed. DuPont was removed from command, to eventually be replaced by John Dahlgren, inventor of the Dahlgren gun. The Army contingent at Port Royal also got a new commander in Brigadier General Quincy Gilmore. Gilmore was the top cadet in the West Point class of 1849 and served in the Corps of Engineers. He had planned and directed the Union attack on Fort Pulaski, which proved beyond a doubt that rifled cannon's ability to destroy masonry defenses. Gilmore was desperate for the position, writing that he was willing to risk my own reputation on attacking Charleston. Gilmore's plan to take Charleston was simple: take Morris Island, level Fort Sumter, and then bring the Navy in to take the city. The force had been left on Folly Island, and they began preparing defenses for the attack on Morris Island. They made their preparations in silence at night, so that the Confederates, only 500 yards away, couldn't hear them. While the Union was preparing, the Southerners were spending their night working on the sunk Keokuk. The Keokuk had sunk in shallow waters, and they were able to take the Dahlgren guns and install them at Fort Sumter. Gilmore planned on assaulting Charleston with around 11,000 infantry, 350 artillerymen, and 400 engineers. He was able to collect cannon as well, including 5 200-pound Parrotts, 9 100-pounders, 12 30-pounders, and 4 20-pounders, along with 30 mortars. Included in his 11,000 infantry were some of the 1st African-American regiments, the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd South Carolina Volunteers, and the 54th Massachusetts Volunteers. By July 1863, the preparations were complete, and the soldiers were waiting orders on Folly Island. Dahlgren officially took command of the naval portion on July 6th, only a few days before the attack. The attack also called for 2 diversions. Meanwhile, General Beauregard continued building up Charleston's defenses, even as he was forced to give up more troops. By June, 10,000 of his defenders had been shipped off to other fronts. By July, around 2,600 infantry, 3,800 artillerymen, and 550 cavalry were stationed in Charleston. Beauregard presaged the Union plans as well, writing in April that I think it's most probable that we'll move from Stono Inlet along Folly Island, thence Morris Island, to endeavor to take Fort Sumter a la Pulaski. But they may find that to be a piece of folly. Still, most of his men remained on James Island, while around 1,000 men, including 650 infantry, defended Morris. Morris Island had significant defenses, 11 batteries at the southern end, along with rifle pits. But most formidable was the battery on the northern end of the island, which the Confederates called Battery Wagner, and the North often called Fort Wagner. Union artillery began their bombardment at 5:08 a.m. on July 10th. The Confederates were surprised at breakfast as the ground and naval cannons opened up with shrapnel and grape shot. Federal infantry landed next, seizing the initial defenses. One regiment landed farther down the beach, appearing in the Confederates' rear and routing the defenders. During the attack, one Federal soldier found a newspaper which reported the victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg. The Confederates retreated to Fort Wagner with a loss of 300 men. Reinforcements were already en route, however. The following day, the Union attack was broken on Fort Wagner. The 7th Connecticut gained the parapet but were trapped and decimated. 339 Union men were lost to only 12 Confederates. The Union prepared for several days before the next attack, setting up breaching batteries. Preparations were made for an attack on July 18th, which was preceded by 8 hours of bombardment. It was impressive, firing a shell once every 2 seconds, but unfortunately it was largely ineffective, causing only minor casualties and failing to destroy the sand-protected walls of the battery. The Confederate force had been reinforced, now numbering over 1,600 men, and using a codebook from Keokuk, the Confederates were fully aware of the coming infantry attack, which came after sunset. The attack itself was led by the 54th Massachusetts and their commander, Colonel Robert Gould Shaw. This attack was depicted in the 1989 movie Glory. Gilmore believed the fort had been destroyed and its garrison demoralized, but the defenses were nearly intact, and the attack was repulsed with bloody casualties. Sergeant William Carney, wounded 4 times, crawled away from the fort with the 54th National Colors, for which would become the first African-American to be awarded the Medal of Honor. Several other units also participated and suffered heavy casualties. Though never certainly ascertained, around 1,500 Union soldiers were captured, killed, or wounded, including Colonel Shaw and General George Strong, while the South lost only 174 men. Though the attack had been a disaster, Gilmore and Dahlgren didn't withdraw. Instead, they prepared for a siege. The ensuing siege exemplified the changing military technology of the 19th century. Complex trenches were dug with covering rifle pits and artillery batteries. The Union constructed wire entanglements, forerunners of barbed wire obstacles. They also made use of Requa guns, a forerunner to the machine gun. Requa guns were designed to replace short-range field guns and consisted of 25 barrels arranged horizontally and strapped to a carriage. 3 men would feed in a clip, and the gun could fire 175 shots per minute. In lulls in the shooting and during prisoner exchanges, Fort Wagner was repaired and reinforced as well. Torpedoes were brought onto land, where they were buried with a board on the contact fuse. They would explode when someone stepped on them, like a modern landmine. Fort Wagner was garrisoned with 1,200 men, whose job was to hold while defenses were prepared in the harbor. Fort Sumter, which was extremely vulnerable to bombardment, had cannons removed while more batteries and reinforcements shifted defenses in the harbor. Around 80 black soldiers of the 54th Massachusetts had been captured in the fighting, and their fate was uncertain. Beauregard asked for guidance, and they were eventually turned over to South Carolina authorities. The law didn't recognize black soldiers and instead demanded that they be tried as slaves in rebellion, or blacks attempting to incite rebellion. This would likely have led to their death, but the South was worried about retaliation. The Union then had the son of the Charleston mayor prisoner. On July 30th, 1863, Lincoln issued a proclamation that specifically included black soldiers under General Order 100, which stated that for every soldier killed in violation of the laws of war, a rebel soldier shall be executed. Ultimately, South Carolina courts determined they didn't have jurisdiction, and the soldiers continued to be held but were not executed. The South's refusal to trade captured black troops eventually led to a near-complete end to prisoner exchanges for the duration of the war. Gillmore needed more troops, and despite General-in-Chief Henry Halleck's opposition, Secretary Welles appealed to Lincoln, who ordered 10,000 men to Charleston, including 8 regiments who were at Gettysburg. Throughout the siege, Union soldiers dug sapping trenches and support batteries, working mostly at night and almost always under fire. Union engineers progressively advanced their trenches, with the 3rd set only 540 yards from Wagner and only 60 from Confederate rifle pits. Gillmore also used bright calcium lights to illuminate the enemy landing area and light up Fort Wagner at night for bombardment. Among the most unique projects was undertaken by Colonel Serrell, who built a battery in the marsh. They drove in sheet pilings before building a gun platform made up of 13,000 sandbags weighing more than 800 tons. And on it they put a 16,300-pound 8-inch Parrott, dubbed the Swamp Angel, that fired into Charleston itself. To Gillmore, the town was a legitimate target, with munition factories and wharves servicing blockade runners. To Beauregard, Gillmore was deliberately targeting civilians. 36 shots of Greek fire, meant to set the city ablaze, were fired before the Swamp Angel exploded. It was never replaced. Bombardment at Fort Sumter began on August 17th. The attack was very different from the attack in 1861. Aimed at Sumter was probably the war's largest concentration of heavy ordnance, per historian Stephen Wise. In one volley, the 38 guns could fling more than 3,000 pounds of metal. Mirroring Gillmore's engineering mind, the guns were run in shifts and would fire continually, day and night, while the monitors joined in. The 6.4-inch Parrotts were to fire every 5 minutes, while the 8-inch Parrotts fired every 8, and the 10-inch gun every 10 minutes. The bombardment began at 5 a.m. on August 17th and lasted until August 23rd. Union guns hit around 78% of the time, and the 10-inch gun was especially impressive. One officer claimed that Folly Island shook every time the gun fired. As bricks flew, one soldier said it was a great pleasure to hear our guns putting the question to old Sumter, "What went ye out of the Union for?" The bombardment was devastating, quickly knocked out most of the fort's guns, and by August 19th the gorge wall was punctured and cannon fire passed into the fort. Still, the garrison held, using destroyed masonry and sand to construct a new, hardier defense. Eventually, the artillery was mostly pulled out, and the fort was defended only by infantry. On August 25th, Union forces rushed and seized the Confederate rifle pits. The 61st North Carolina Infantry was overrun. In the final stages, the Union used a sap roller, a 9-foot-long, 4-foot-diameter cylinder that weighed a ton and was slowly rolled forward to protect engineers as they dug trenches towards the fort. They also had to deal with Confederate torpedoes. They pulled out more than 60. They had to either defuse or cut into the shells to dispose of them. On September 5th, the Federals began their last push. It began with a bombardment, and the sappers pressed their trenches nearly up to against the battery. Infantry prepared to take the battery itself on the morning of September 7th. On the night of the 6th, realizing the position was untenable, the Confederate garrison quietly spiked their cannons and withdrew. The South had successfully pulled out more than 1,000 men, and the Union occupied the fort without opposition. The only failure was the magazine didn't explode. One Confederate soldier was so relieved to be free that he said, "Hell can't be any worse than Battery Wagner. I got out of that, and the other place ain't going to worry me anymore." Capturing Morris Island hardly completed the capture of Charleston, however, and by September the working relationship between Dahlgren and Gillmore had completely broken down. Both planned their own attack on Sumter and ultimately refused to work together, though they intended to attack the fort on the same night. The attack was a disaster. The Army pulled back after seeing the Navy land first, and the Navy men became so confused only a quarter of the force actually landed. They were quickly captured. That ended the Army campaign against Charleston. Gilmore was promoted to Major General, and the units of Morris put on a 3-hour parade. The Navy was expected to continue the attack, but without Sumter, had to have run the harbor defenses. In October, Secretary Wells finally decided it wasn't worth the risk. The Army and Navy each blamed each other for the anticlimactic finish. The Morris Island campaign took 2 months, cost hundreds of lives for very little gain. The grueling campaign ended with the Union only in control of some of the outer defenses, but Fort Sumter and Charleston remained in Confederate hands and would remain defended until they finally had to be abandoned in the face of Sherman's march. The campaign did, however, end Charleston's career as a blockade-running port, and towards the end it did distract some Confederate troops from other fronts. The engineering work done there can be seen as sort of an intermediate point between the fighting of the early 19th century and the technology-driven horror of the early 20th century. The charge of the 54th Massachusetts might be remembered, but the rest of the campaign is largely forgotten, as Clara Barton, founder of the Red Cross and a nurse who assisted during the campaign, said, "We have captured 1 fort, Gregg, 1 charnel house, Wagner, and 1 cemetery, Morris Island." I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.